The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
There are property companies in Sweden with Russian-sanctioned oligarchs. There are road construction companies in Norway owned by South Korean entities. Sometimes the crazy thing is just like it looks so vanilla, but then you start digging into it and it just becomes this complete other thing, like a web of connected people and companies.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. Mapping out the structures, connecting the individuals in charge, uncovering the potentially shadowy influences behind a business, UBO discovery work is some of the most important work any compliance professional can do. But how does it differ from KYC and other compliance processes? Why is it essential to have UBO mapping in place? And how does it matter in the global fight against financial crime? I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are discussing everything you need to know about UBOs. And by everything, we mean everything. We'll be asking, what is the current state of play when it comes to UBO discovery in the industry? What are the biggest challenges? And how can we get to a more effective future where we unearth the full picture of every business? And to dive into this topic, I'm joined by two of my amazing colleagues, Fredrik and Robin. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
You are also co-host, so maybe it's a bit weird to say welcome back to the show, but this is our second episode, the three of us together. What is the one thing you guys hope our listeners take from this episode?
For me, I think the most important part from this episode is just how fundamental UBO data, so the ultimate beneficial owners, are as the foundational piece in getting the right data when you onboard and do periodic reviews of customers.
I kind of hope our listeners feel a little less bad about how complex this task is, because it is super complicated.
It is actually, in fact, it is so much more complicated than you might think. But let's dive into the state of play and current challenges. So, Robin, we have people who might just have started in the industry, and they are like, what's your best definition of UBOs and UBO discovery?
UBO, ultimate beneficial owner, is the person who ultimately owns, controls, or benefits from a business or asset, even if their name doesn't appear directly on ownership records. Identifying UBOs is critical for compliance, as it reveals the true people behind companies, preventing misuse of corporate structures for illegal purposes like money laundering. UBO discovery is the process of uncovering these ultimate owners, often involving complex investigations through public records, corporate structures, and global databases to identify hidden layers of ownership and control.
Well, Great to have GPT back on the show as well. I mean, that's also becoming a standard, a regular guest of ours.
Yeah, sorry, I'll put away my chat GPT for now. But I think that's a pretty clear definition. But in short, it's whoever benefits or controls the company or asset you're looking at. And the discovery part is, how do you find those people?
And that might sound super simple. Why isn't it straightforward to just figure out who owns a company or owns an asset? But how does this discovery process look like today, Fredrik?
Well, I think GPT kind of put it neatly already, but it's definitely mostly regarding gathering the data from multiple sources. This could be the company registries, this could be financial statements, or even having to do investigative work to understand who controls a company and make up shares. So an example could be that on paper from public registers, somebody might have 25% ownership, which is usually the percentage where you then define as an ultimate beneficial owner. But that's not necessarily always the case in terms of who is actually controlling the company. Because at times, as an example, you have relatives, which controls 12.5% each. And if those two combine in a board meeting, say, and they both vote in favor for one particular item, That means they are then alternately beneficial owners, and they have controlling interest, and they sit with the business power to make decisions, which then is more important, right?
And coming to those end results, that's actually quite cumbersome today in many instances. What's some of the ways that you have seen people doing that, like in 2024? We are here, we even have GPT as our guest. There's so many things that's possible, but how are people doing it today?
Well, I've seen people drawing out ownership charts in PowerPoint. I've seen amazing looking link analytics on a paper process. So yeah, there are multiple ways of gathering the data.
It is interesting. It's interesting how much time is spent on the simple cases in all of this, and how little time, is spent on the complex cases. So the ones that stick out when you say, like, what have you seen? It's definitely like the processes where it takes 2 hours just to get an overview for like a normal company who are the beneficial owners. And then for more complex cases that might span into different jurisdictions where ownership information is harder to get, such as Panama or any tax haven, to name a couple of examples. I've seen processes where this then might take 2 weeks, but to be fair, not everyone has time to do that. And what ends up happening is that you kind of just have to trust what the person on the other side of a phone call tells you, because you don't have the operational bandwidth to deep dive into those investigations.
You've seen things. Let's get to some UBO stories. What have you seen out there of this UBO discovery process, figuring out like shady UBOs? Do you have any interesting or dirty stories? Not dirty stories, but dirty UBO stories.
Well, I'm kind of scared to mention names, but there are property companies in Sweden with Russian sanctioned oligarchs. There are road construction companies in Norway owned by South Korean entities. The list goes on. And sometimes the crazy thing is just like, it looks so vanilla when you like open up the registry based information, but then you start digging into it and you start building out the ownership charts, and it just becomes this complete other thing, like a web of connected people and companies, especially where they are actually trying to obscure their ownership.
Yeah, I remember when we went to this anti-money laundering conference. I'm not going to name which one and where. And I remember, I think it was you, Robin, who helped piece together this presentation. We actually found a construction project just around the corner from the venue that was like through 10 layers of ownership, actually owned by a sanctioned oligarch. I don't remember if the ownership percentage added up to like 25%, or if it was like a UBO, or if it was just like a owner, but that I remember clearly as well. And just like, okay, it looks like a vanilla construction project, some new apartments, but in fact it's an oligarch who owns this in the Nordics. Do you think we're too naive about who owns what?
In the Nordics, specifically? Yeah, I think so. I think we have a very low corruption index. We are a society based on a lot of trust, which is extremely good and something we need to continue to fight to maintain. However, it does have its drawbacks. And I think that we might be a bit naive in terms of looking into what type of construction projects or what type of industry that we do allow for in terms of international owners owning pieces and bits and pieces of companies in Norway, as an example.
Yeah, not only companies, like property is probably the most obscured part. And I think that there is a high risk of Scandinavia in general becoming like Scandigrad. Well, now I guess it's more difficult for Russians in particular, or kleptocrats, to enter the Scandinavian market. But the ones that are already here through obscured ownership, it's something that we do not have a lot of knowledge about.
I remember this recent news article about Russian ownership of cabins in the Norwegian mountains right across from the military bases and so forth. Like,
yeah.
That was also just completely new information.
Yeah, and the recent article about the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Stockholm, placed near military base as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of these things.
One aspect of this, which is not apparent but super important for all listeners to know is that if you have a majority stake or a controlling stake in a company, you can ask for a lot of information regarding blueprints when you look at sort of security documents. And basically, if you start getting an ownership stake in infrastructure, as an example, but all of a sudden you've disclosed a lot of the potential underground railways, like the security documentations and so forth. So from a security perspective, this is super important as well.
Yep.
Okay, with how important it is, you should think that UBO data is just readily available anywhere for everyone, but that is not the case at all. So if you are piecing together an ownership chart, you either have to rely on publicly available information or then just getting information from the company itself that you then have to trust or not trust. But if we go back to this publicly available data sources, how joined up are these different various registries? And are we really satisfied with the current state of company registries? And I'm thinking then specifically, like we are in Europe, so maybe that European context first.
In specifically discussing the company registries, then definitely not. And that's why we see a lot of initiatives happening on that end as well to make that more transparent and make it better. Now, I think it's easy to argue that some of these initiatives isn't going to be the silver bullet, and it's also going to create a lot of false trust in sort of the public data being really good. Meanwhile, what is the fact now with the status quo is that the industry knows that the data is fragmented, knows that the industry is in high quality, and that also means that they do have to keep an eye out and don't just trust data blindly, which is actually quite kind of a good thing in this perspective. What do you think, Robin?
Yeah, I think there's no unified way of gathering the data or how you should define the UBOs, and we're seeing the initiatives in AMLD6 and new regulatives, but when you have contradicting laws, the Norwegian anti-money laundering law is contradicting to the Norwegian UBO registry law. So the UBO registry that we're now seeing just being phased in Norway will kind of be useless in some context for actually using it in an anti-money laundering context. And it's so strange that we have this contradicting way of gathering UBO data when it's pretty clear what we're all trying to do.
So what do you think is the problem with the UBO registry in Norway, for instance?
Well, the definition, for one, we're seeing the new regulatives with AMLD6. There is a strong distinction between ownership and control. There's the new definition that if there is a high-risk entity, you should lower the threshold of the percentage ownership.
So the bar is sliding kind of on what, like where the ownership,
from 25 to 15 isn't it? And 10 in some cases.
Yeah, it's kind of up to your own risk policy if you want to. It's minimum 15. But you can do 10 if you wanted to, if you have a lower risk threshold. But the problem is that if you put a definition at 25%, but in some cases it's less, then where do you get that data? If you can't rely on the UBO registry, so then it becomes a pointless exercise to integrate your systems into a UBO registry when it doesn't have the data that you need and it doesn't allow for setting thresholds.
Also, just to add on that, this is then going to be a registry which relies on self-reporting, which also is a problem because with, at least in Norway, the way that it's usually structured is from the stocks, basically.
Shareholders registry.
Yes, which is the foundational data. Now, it also has its drawbacks, so definitely looking at this in combination might be a good way moving forward. But what we've seen from countries where they have had to rely on self-reporting is that it's prone to errors because humans don't necessarily care. Like if you're just a normal business operator owner, I mean, then like why is it so important that you update the exact bracket? Like if you might get a new person on the ownership side, maybe you wait quite a while until you update the bracket, like, and so forth. And these errors will matter when it comes to finding the UBOs.
It will definitely trickle down into a lot of work for compliance teams in banks who really need to make sure they have good processes for this. So if you don't get UBO rights and you are in charge of that at a regulated company, what's the risk you're running?
The ultimate one, because that's so fundamental. It's the ownership, and the ownership controls what the business is doing, basically, to put it simply. And if you don't get the ownership data right and get the UBOs right, you risk having kleptocrats, having oligarchs, and facilitating financial crime, because you don't know who you're doing business with.
What he said.
It also brings us to okay, the public is trying to do good by, implementing UBO registries, but it's contradictory in some cases, and banks need to make sure they have documented who UBOs are. The public also need easy access to incorporate businesses, but who is the ones ultimately bearing the burden of making sure UBO discovery is getting the right results? All right, we'll be right back to talk about how UBO mapping is evolving and what comes next. Don't go anywhere. Strise turns KYB from a costly burden into an automated winner. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear what one of Europe's largest payment companies, Vipps Mobile Pay, has to say.
In the olden days, there were people sitting there Googling the company name, all the brand names, the CEO and so on. I think they used more effort into the process than evaluating the outcome, and that's what I'm looking for. I would say Strise definitely helped us improve our productivity. So working more efficiently, working more risk-based, automizing repetitive processes, and by this helping us, of course, to decrease costs, but also improve customer satisfaction. Being able to make low-risk decisions automated without long waiting times, that's of course extremely important. Strise, one tool that works in all our markets, that we are able to collaborate, to have streamlined processes, to have optimized processes, to have one tool, one source of truth that is collecting all the input from a lot of other sources, so you don't need to open 3 different tools, but everything consolidated one place. Either you are part of the scalable automation game and work risk-based as everyone else, or you will not survive the competition. Strise is really helping us realizing those ambitions and goals.
Explore the AML Automation Cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information. All right, we need to look to the future. We've talked a lot about problems because the data is hard to come by. It's hard to trust. It's hard to piece together. It's spread across jurisdiction. It's pieced together manually. There is so many problems with UBO mapping today, but we need to look to the future and the solution. So how do you guys see the regulatory pressure evolving on openness around UBOs?
Well, there are quite a few initiatives put into play already. A while back, we did an interview with the AMLA, and they also work a lot on this in terms of making it more transparent, making it more unified in terms of understanding exactly what should be defined from an EU perspective. Like Robin alluded to, there's conflicts now from certain jurisdictions contradicting a few of the definitions from EU. That will hopefully not be the case once that's done. Plus, there's been an ongoing debate about having an open European registers for beneficial owners as well.
Yeah, because I was also just thinking, so many good things about the EU. What if the EU, we could just stop with the different local business registries and we just had you incorporate in the EU? It's just a unified way of starting a business. It's all in just one registry. You could then easily see kind of ownership across borders, because that is, of course, a huge problem with VAT refund frauds in Europe. I was just thinking, why can't we just do that?
And I wonder, if it's too much of a stick and not enough carrot. Why can't we have some sort of benefits for any type of company or owners that would share all data in real time in one trusted platform that you could tap into and openly say, yes, I agree to sharing this data with these certain organizations, and the benefit they would reap from it could be a multitude. Like it could be, I don't know, lower interest rates. I don't like it could probably be 10,000 different.
We could find something to incentivize it. Exactly. What do you think, Robin? Do you want a just unified European business registry with just like all the ownership in a unified way across all of Europe?
Yeah, I'm scared to let this become a political discussion. Like, I'm so old that I remember the anti-EU demonstrations in the 80s. But no, I don't think a unified registry would solve it. I think data sharing across private and public sector is the way to go. And I'm hoping this is what we'll see going forward. I think the transparency need in the existing UBO registry should be open to private sector. We're seeing now as a tech provider, it's difficult to get access to some of these registries. We're seeing it in Norway already. We have a new UBO registry coming, and it's only accessible for the regulated entities. And we have to set up this cumbersome process of accessing the registry with the delegated access from the regulated entities. And it shouldn't be like that when we are trying to fight financial crime.
Yeah. If you guys had a magic wand then to make UBO discovery simpler and more effective, what would you want to see? What would be your thing?
Well, I think this is where some sort of entity verification network would need to come into play. So what I would like to see is kind of like the example that I did allude to now, which is a network model where you can verify a profile for at least a certain amount of time, and businesses, banks as an example, could tap into that insight and very quickly know that they have an industry peer that have already done sort of the grunt work. Now, obviously, there's a lot of constraints, there's a lot of risk, but I think those are smaller in comparison to the risks we're running now, running around chasing shadows.
What would you do with if you got a magic UBO wand?
Well, I'm not going to go full crazy on tech, but I think network validation of a business profile is a really interesting thought. I think there are players in the market like open corporates that are doing interesting stuff now, but definitely making it accessible and available, and perhaps even incentivizing businesses, like you said. I like the idea.
I think I would use Oliver Bullo's, which was to make the ownership publicly available in the United States. I think he said something that would be like a bomb going off or something, because suddenly you could actually see what people owned, and he said there would be a lot of surprises there and a lot of people camouflaging wealth, both US nationals and foreigners. So I think I would go with that one. Transparent registry in the US, please. We need to talk about AI. So I was in Abu Dhabi a while back for Google's finance conference there, and I was wondering who owned something, and I just asked ChatGPT, and it of course gave me some answers, but I was like, is that true? I have no idea. How do you guys think AI will change or not change the space of UBO discovery?
Yeah, ChatGPT is interesting because we're seeing much more grounded search capabilities now, so you're actually getting source references. So it is a tool. I suggest using it, kind of keeping up with that curiosity of using it. I wouldn't use it as documentation though, but as a pointer, yeah, definitely makes sense. But I think there are much more interesting technologies when it comes to utilizing AI and tech as a way of building out this, like, machine learning models looking at open data, say other users have suggested that these entities belong together, things like that. I think that's interesting.
And you, Fredrik?
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't use ChatGPT, which pulls information from everything on the internet
and generate something.
Yeah, hallucinates.
You're like, is it true? Is it not? I don't know.
But there are definitely technologies and programs that's based on large language models that's only trained to use the data that you do provide. And that's super interesting, I think. So that you can imagine having some sort of co-pilot where you can basically ask them to help you with your investigative work. Now, that's very much on a case-by-case or potential like business-wide risk assessment level. But I also think for AI just the sheer fact like it will be able to index so much information in a simpler way will help automate a lot of cases. And there's tons of risk involved in that as well, in terms of like AI biases, and obviously we have data sharing, which is an issue, but like with synthetic data, we can start sharing sort of like some commonalities between like these industries or the banks, like we talked about, to help build predictive analytics. And I think that will be one of the key changes that we will see in a couple of years' time, where we go away from being reactive and like going on a case by case, drawing out this analytics manually ourselves, to having AI help us find these anomalies in the data sets to be predictive and cut off the money before it reaches the criminals, basically.
Yeah. If we go down the AI automation route, there is definitely a level of risk. How do you think about that? Is there something about the UBO discovery process that you guys wouldn't hand over to an AI or automation?
Definitely. Definitely. I think AI needs to be basically there as a tool. It shouldn't automate the entire process. You have to take it step by step. What's the phrase? Crawl, walk, run. So like you need to start with the crawling aspect and automate the easiest of the easy cases, see that works, and then work your way towards the threshold of where you should always have humans in the loop.
Yeah, because now we're entering an era with heightened sanctions. There's a lot of international conflict. Do you guys think that ownership structures will become more complex? That just on like a global level, there's more companies with complex ownership structures due to the nature of these geopolitical tensions. That means that more people need to kind of hide their ownership of assets or businesses or properties.
Yeah, it's kind of, almost obviously, yes. We're seeing people being hit by sanctions and then carefully orchestrating everything that needs to happen the minute the sanctions hit. So they've already planned this. They have financial planners that orchestrate their movements of shares, ownership. They're using family. Sometimes it's super obvious as well. Like they're just moving shares over to their wife and their children. Now, it's kind of crazy that they think that that's enough. But I think what we're seeing is sort of that reactive phase as well. So, okay, you lower your threshold of ownership to 24.9% because then you're not a UBO. And then the EU directive comes in and says, well, if it's high risk, we're going to say 15%. And then the kleptocrats start splitting up their ownership into smaller companies and then having obscure trusts ownership charts will become more and more complex. It's actually easier to locate the oligarchs if they at least have 30, 40, 50%, then we know they're there. So the regulatives might actually be causing more difficulties because they're just splitting up into smaller shell companies.
But companies, it's just a human invention as well with the, tax laws. Couldn't we just invent a different way of running businesses that was easier for everyone to see who owned what? Can't we just like make a human invention and flip this on its head? All right, we are nearing the end of the episode. Fredrik, what is the societal cost of not getting UBO discovery right?
We've already touched upon it, but it's the ultimate one. It's it's really important for us as a society to make sure we keep the criminals out, obviously. And the only way to keep the criminals out is by making sure they don't have an infrastructure to run their illegal funds through. And the way to do that is
to get a bank account.
Yes, exactly. And then if the banks make sure they have the proper UBOs and they understand who they're doing business with, because this is the interesting part about the law of like large numbers, right? If I now know that I have one customer, then I will do so much due diligence to understand what's the risk of this one customer. And then, all right, if I had 10 customers, all right, then I will do a lot of due diligence still. So what's the exact threshold where we stop treating this as individual risk and we just look at the big number and think like we need to automate this bank account number? And I think that's an important perspective in all of this.
Okay, but before we end this episode, I'm going to dish out some quick fire questions for the two of you. Fredrik, I'll start with you. The first rule of UBO discovery is...
Never talk about Fight Club. No, I'm kidding. It's trust the data.
Okay, Robin, what is the craziest thing you've found in the UBO map of a company in Norway?
Well, I found a Norwegian investor that utilizes the same enabler secretary company in Cyprus as most of the sanctioned oligarchs do. That was pretty wild.
That was pretty wild. I wish we could say who it was on the show, but if you want to know, DM us and we can tell you in private. And finally, Fredrik, what's the most important thing for banks in terms of UBO discovery going forward?
Investing in data and technology.
Robin?
I think getting good processes in place to separate between control and ownership, and also, as I always say, to be curious.
Stay curious out there, people. That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Fredrik and Robin, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
My LinkedIn?
Yes, LinkedIn/Robin Lycka.
Money makes a world go round.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in and listened to us for this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalog and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd also love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels, tell your colleagues about it, drop it in a group chat. It really helps people to find us. Got a story you think we should be talking about? You can comment on the Strise LinkedIn page, my LinkedIn page, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. Our engineer was Nicholas. And The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Visit our website, strise.ai, for more information. See you next time.
Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round.
And by the magic of technology, we moved the plant.
I have seen things you wouldn't believe.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.